I hereby do solemnly swear that I shall strictly adhere to a no spoilers rule within this review. Now this is less out of an admirable sense of honour and more out of a fear of having my home razed to the ground by people who take this shit far too seriously. Because if I ever am going to be firebombed in my life, I want it to be for a fuck lot more than slightly lessening someone's enjoyment of sitting still in a dark room for 2.5 hours. So I shall forgo the customary summing up of the plot and move on discussing the things that I liked and did not about The Dark Knight Rises. One thing I did like about this film is that the third act is an engaging, entertaining and sporadically thrilling climax to Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. It contains some genuine surprises and is the kind of slick blend of narrative and action that we haven't seen since Jason Bourne last visited your local flea pit. I also like that the new DC logo looks like a yogurt pot being opened, and early on in the film a policeman makes his siren sound a lot like a chicken. However, the excellent third act is unfortunately a delicious dessert that follows on from a stodgy and over-seasoned meal that constitutes the rest of the film. Just like in his remake of The Fantastic Voyage, yet again we see Christopher Nolan attempt to walk the tightrope of complexity only to tumble off and land in the safety net of convolution, and anyone who doesn't applaud this normally gets screamed at by worryingly enthusiastic members of the audience. Well, I think there's a lot to be said for telling a simple story well rather than telling an unnecessarily complicated story in which a lot needs to be said. There is enough plot in the first hour and three-quarters of this film to fill an entire trilogy, and it reduces all the characters to mechanical exposition dispensers as they constantly have to explain what's going on, why that thing is happening, how this works, how they feel, how they ended up feeling like this. And there's actually very little acting going on. It's almost as if the directors and actors' notes have been read out as dialogue by mistake, and it soon becomes an exhausting and suffocating experience with things like interpretation, expression and subtext being long forgotten. Even when the American national anthem is sung in an almost ethereal manner and you think the film is finally going to shut the fuck up for once, it still has to hit you with yet another explanation of something and suggests that this is a director who has gained much as a visualist and craftsman but has lost sight of the reasons for doing so. Another major issue is the villain of the piece, Bane. Although he certainly carries the hefty physical presence you would expect Tom Hardy to bring to this role, his overdubbed dialogue is only slightly less embarrassing but nowhere near as fun as Sam J. Jones in Flash Gordon. It seriously sounds like he's carrying around a 5.1 surround system to voice his thoughts with, and in the fight scenes with Batman it generally seems less of a battle of strength and guile, and more of a contest to see who can make their voice sound like it's being pushed through a cheese grater. I know Batman going up against a more physical foe is something we haven't seen that much of in his big screen outings, but it's always more satisfying to see him come up against a villain who tries to outwit and outmaneuver him instead. He is, after all, supposed to be the world's greatest detective, and there's precious little detecting going on here. More welcome additions to the series, however, are Anne Hathaway and Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Anne Hathaway, Selina Kyle, is never actually referred to as Catwoman, which is a good thing too, because if someone even turned up to a fancy dress party in this outfit and claimed to be Catwoman, they should be told to go home and put some effort in. But instead she delivers a memorable mercenary who may just care a little bit more than she's letting on, and isn't as lightweight as some were fearing. Joseph Gordon-Levitt's up-and-coming cop is actually the closest the film comes to giving us a proper character, and is one of the few reasons to regret that this is the last outing of Gotham City in this incarnation. I suppose I should also mention the film's attempt to be all sociological and political, with the 99% of Gotham turning on the 1%, but it's handled in a very obvious and ham-fisted manner and has far less to say about our current economic climate than a film about a stripper did last week. Overall, The Dark Knight Rises is slightly disappointing, with the third act being forced to make amends for the bloated, poorly paced and structured narrative that precedes it. It would have been better to start the whole film from about halfway through the proceedings, which would have given everything a bit more room to breathe. It also never reaches the heights of The Dark Knight's villain set pieces and never even comes close to the cohesion and characterisation of Batman Begins, and I did find myself longing for the more elegant simplicity and fun of that first instalment. I think it's also fair to say that Christopher Nolan has taken the whole thing a bit too seriously and has met with the unfortunate truth that the closer you bring a comic book superhero to reality, the more preposterous they become. And in trying to avoid that problem by explaining and pointing out every goddamn facet and machination of how everything works, the process has become unwieldy. And while that may have averted some stretching of credibility, it has done the opposite for my patience and tolerance. Still, this film does, eventually, provide a fitting send-off for this version of the Caped Crusader, and the high points of the trilogy should stop anyone else from shining the bat symbol onto the big screen for quite some time. So if you do find yourself in need of someone who speaks with a silly voice and spends all their time and money building devices to maim people who have done bad things, why don't you give this guy a try instead?